Here's a question for you. What does it actually mean when historians say a single battle changed the course of history? Because that phrase gets thrown around constantly, right? Every battle is supposedly the one that shaped civilization as we know it. Most of the time, it's hyperbole, exaggeration. A desperate attempt to make content sound more important than it actually is. But sometimes, rarely, it's absolutely true. July 16, 1212. A scorching plateau in southern Spain called Las Navas de Tolosa. That's where 70,000 Christian warriors faced down 125,000 Almohad soldiers in what became the single most decisive battle of the 800-year Reconquista. And when the dust settled after 6 hours of brutal, grinding combat, the balance of power in Iberia had fundamentally shifted. Permanently. This wasn't just another medieval skirmish. This was the day the Almohad Caliphate, the most powerful Muslim empire in the Western Mediterranean, broke. The day Christian Spain went from defensive survival mode to unstoppable expansion. The day the Reconquista stopped being a dream and became an inevitability. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another crusade battle. Another Christians versus Muslims narrative. You've heard it all before, right? Except here's what makes Las Navas different. This wasn't about religion alone. It was about survival. About 3 Christian kingdoms that despised each other, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre, somehow putting aside centuries of rivalry to face an existential threat. It was about a Berber caliph so confident in his military superiority that he essentially invited his enemies to come get slaughtered. And it was about how terrain, tactics, and one perfectly timed cavalry charge turned what should have been a Christian massacre into an Almohad catastrophe. If you're skeptical, good, you should be, because the real story of Las Navas de Tolosa isn't the sanitized, romanticized version you'll find in most history books. It's not about noble crusaders riding to save Christendom from the infidel hordes. It's about desperation, political calculation, strategic brilliance, and an empire that got so arrogant it walked straight into a trap of its own making. So here's what we're doing. We're going to reconstruct this battle from the ground up. We are going to examine the geopolitical context that made it inevitable. We're going to analyze the tactics, the terrain, the leadership decisions, and the human cost. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why this one battle in 1212 essentially sealed the fate of Muslim Spain for the next 3 centuries. And if that sounds interesting to you, hit that like button right now, because this is the kind of history most channels won't touch. No oversimplification, no dumbing down, just the raw, complicated, fascinating truth about how 70,000 men broke an empire. Let's start with the Almohads. Because if you don't understand who they were and what they represented, you won't understand why Las Navas mattered so much. The Almohad Caliphate in 1212 wasn't some declining remnant of Islamic Spain's glory days. They were the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. They controlled all of North Africa from modern-day Libya to the Atlantic. They controlled southern Spain, Al-Andalus. They had crushed the previous Muslim dynasty, the Almoravids, in a brutal conquest campaign. They had defeated multiple Christian armies. They had pushed the Christian kingdoms back to the northern mountains and kept them there for decades. And they were fundamentalist purists. The Almohads weren't some tolerant, cosmopolitan civilization. They were religious zealots who believed in strict Islamic orthodoxy, who had zero patience for deviation, and who saw the Christian kingdoms of the north not just as political rivals, but as heretical abominations that needed to be eradicated. Their name literally means the Unitarians, a reference to their radical emphasis on the absolute oneness of God. They didn't do compromise, they didn't do coexistence, they did conquest and conversion. In 1212, the Almohad Caliph was a man named Muhammad al-Nasir. Al-Nasir means the victor. And up until Las Navas, that title was accurate. He had inherited a vast empire from his father, had consolidated power, had maintained dominance over both North Africa and Spain, and was convinced, absolutely convinced, that he was destined to finish what his predecessors started. To drive the Christians completely out of Iberia, to restore Al-Andalus to pure Islamic rule, to be remembered as the Caliph who ended the Christian resistance once and for all. He had every reason to be confident. His army in 1212 was massive. Estimates vary, but most historians agree he brought somewhere between 100,000 and 125,000 men into Spain for this campaign. That's not an exaggeration. That's not medieval chroniclers inflating numbers. The Almohads had the population, the resources, and the administrative infrastructure to field an army that large. And it wasn't just quantity. The core of the Almohad military was elite, professional soldiers, Berber cavalry from the Atlas Mountains, blackguard infantry, freed slaves who served as the Caliph's personal shock troops, Andalusian cavalry who knew the terrain, archers, engineers, siege specialists. This was a combined arms military machine that had been honed through decades of warfare, and al-Nasir knew how to use it. He wasn't some incompetent ruler playing general. He had military experience. He understood logistics, tactics, siege warfare, battlefield coordination. He was smart, ruthless, and determined. So in early 1212, he crossed the Strait of Gibraltar with that enormous army, marched into southern Spain, and essentially issued a challenge to the Christian kingdoms. Come fight me. I'm going to crush you, take your cities, and end this pathetic resistance once and for all. It was arrogance. But it was arrogance backed by very real power. Now let's talk about the Christian side, because in 1212, Christian Spain was not unified at all. There were three major kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, and Navarre. And they spent almost as much time fighting each other as they did fighting the Muslims. Medieval Iberia was a political nightmare. Competing claims, territorial disputes, dynastic rivalries, personal feuds. These kingdoms did not like each other. They did not trust each other. And under normal circumstances, they would never have cooperated. But the Almohad invasion wasn't normal circumstances. It was an existential threat. Al-Nasir wasn't targeting one kingdom. He was targeting all of them. And for once, the Christian rulers understood. If they didn't unify, they were going to get picked off one by one. The man who made that unity happen was King Alfonso VIII of Castile. Alfonso was 57 years old in 1212. He had been king for over 4 decades. He had spent his entire life fighting the Almohads, and he had lost to them, badly. In 1195, at a place called Alarcos, an Almohad army had annihilated Alfonso's forces. It was one of the worst Christian defeats of the entire Reconquista. Alfonso barely escaped with his life. Tens of thousands of his soldiers died. The Almohads followed up by raiding deep into Castilian territory, burning cities, enslaving populations, and demonstrating that they could strike anywhere, anytime. Alfonso never forgot Alarcos. For 17 years, he prepared for revenge. He rebuilt his army. He fortified his borders. He sought alliances, and when al-Nasir invaded in 1212, Alfonso saw his chance. Not just for revenge, for survival, he called for help. He appealed to the Pope Innocent III, who declared the campaign a crusade. That designation mattered. It meant volunteers from across Christian Europe would come. It meant financial support. It meant this wasn't just a regional war, it was a holy cause. And the other Iberian kings listened. King Peter II of Aragon agreed to join. King Sancho VII of Navarre agreed to join. These were not altruistic decisions. Aragon and Navarre understood that if Castile fell, they were next. This was realpolitik, but it worked. By June 1212, Alfonso had assembled an army. Estimates put it around 70,000 men. That included Castilian regulars, Aragonese and Navarrese troops, knights from France and other parts of Europe who answered the crusade call, military orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the Order of Calatrava, the Order of Santiago. These weren't just random soldiers. The military orders were elite heavy cavalry. Professional warriors who lived for combat. The Iberian contingents were experienced fighters who had been battling the Almohads for years, and the foreign crusaders brought fresh manpower and morale. 70,000 men was a huge army for medieval Christian Spain, but it was still outnumbered, badly, so Alfonso had a choice. He could play it safe, stay behind fortifications, and wait for the Almohads to come to him. Or he could do something insane. He could march south into Almohad territory and force a battle on his terms. He chose insane. On June 20, 1212, the Christian army left Toledo and began the march south. Destination: the mountain passes that led into Andalusia. The plan was simple in concept, suicidal in execution. Cross the Sierra Morena mountain range, descend into the plains beyond, and engage the Almohad army in open battle before they could consolidate their forces and besiege Christian cities. It was a gamble, a massive gamble. Because if the Almohads caught the Christian army in the mountains, strung out in narrow passes, unable to maneuver, vulnerable to ambush, it would be a slaughter. The entire Christian force could be destroyed without ever reaching open ground. But Alfonso had intelligence. He knew Al-Nasir was gathering his forces near a place called Jaén in the plains south of the Sierra Morena. He knew the Almohads weren't expecting the Christians to march directly into their territory, and he had a guide. A local shepherd who knew a secondary pass through the mountains, less obvious, less guarded, but passable for an army. That shepherd's name was Martin al-Hajjah, and he's one of those historical figures who doesn't get nearly enough credit, because without him, the Christian army never makes it through the mountains. They get bottled up in the main passes, the Almohads block them, and the entire campaign ends before it starts. But al-Hajjah led them through. It took days. The army had to move in columns, struggling over rough terrain, with scouts constantly watching for Almohad patrols, but they made it. On July 13, 1212, the Christian army emerged from the mountains onto the plain of Las Navas de Tolosa, and for the first time, they saw the Almohad army waiting for them. Let's talk about what they saw, because the size difference was staggering. Even from a distance, the Almohad camp stretched for miles, tens of thousands of tents, cavalry units, infantry formations, banners from across North Africa and Al-Andalus. The Caliph's personal guard, the Black Guard, in their distinctive armor, positioned around the massive royal tent at the center of the camp. Supply wagons. Siege equipment. This wasn't just an army, it was a mobile city. The Christian army, by comparison, was smaller, more compact, and let's be honest, probably terrified. Because no matter how much training you have, no matter how much faith you have in your cause, seeing an enemy force that outnumbers you nearly 2-to-1 is a psychological shock. But they didn't retreat. They couldn't. Retreating back through the mountain passes would be suicide. The Almohads would pursue, attack them in the mountains, and annihilate them piecemeal. The only option was forward. Alfonso established a defensive position. The plain of Las Navas wasn't entirely flat. There were low ridges, some broken ground, enough elevation variance to provide defensive advantages. The Christian army set up on higher ground, facing south toward the Almohad position, and they waited for 2 days. July 13 and 14 were spent in preparation. Scouts ranged between the armies, observing positions, looking for weaknesses. Foraging parties searched for water and supplies. Leaders held councils, debating tactics, assigning positions, trying to boost morale. Priests moved through the camps, hearing confessions, blessing soldiers, reminding everyone that they were fighting for God and Christendom. On the Almohad side, Al-Nasir was confident. He had the numbers, he had the position. And he believed, genuinely believed, that the Christians marching into his territory was a gift. They had handed him the opportunity to destroy them in a single decisive battle. He sent messengers to Alfonso, offering terms: surrender, convert to Islam, pledge vassalage, or die. Alfonso refused, obviously. The entire campaign was predicated on fighting. There was no turning back now, so both armies prepared for battle. And on the morning of July 16, 1212, they finally collided. The battlefield was a plain roughly 5 kilometers wide, bordered by low hills. The Christian army was positioned on the northern side, their backs to the Sierra Morena. The Almohad army was to the south, arrayed in a massive crescent formation designed to envelop the Christian flanks. It was a classic numerical superiority tactic. Use your size advantage to wrap around the enemy, attack from multiple angles, and crush them through sheer mass. The Christian deployment was more compact. 3 main divisions, each commanded by one of the kings. Alfonso VII of Castile commanded the center. Peter II of Aragon commanded the left wing. Sancho VII of Navarre commanded the right wing. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, Calatrava, Santiago, were distributed across the line, providing elite shock cavalry at critical points. Archers and crossbowmen were positioned in front, tasked with disrupting the initial Almohad advance. Infantry formed the core of the line, with heavy cavalry held in reserve behind them. Al-Nasir's deployment was more elaborate. His first line was light infantry and archers, Andalusian and North African troops meant to wear down the Christian advance with missile fire. Behind them were the main infantry formations, Berber and Arab soldiers, heavily armed, disciplined, and experienced. Behind them were the cavalry wings, thousands of mounted warriors meant to sweep around the Christian flanks once the infantry engaged. And at the very rear, on a low hill, was the Caliph's command position. His royal tent, his black guard, his personal cavalry reserve. Al-Nasir positioned himself where he could observe the entire battle and direct reserves to wherever they were needed. It was a textbook deployment for a numerically superior force. Use the numbers to pin the enemy, flank them, and overwhelm them through coordinated pressure. The battle began around mid-morning. The Almohad first line advanced. Thousands of archers and light infantry moved forward, closing the distance, and began loosing volleys of arrows into the Christian ranks. The Christians responded with crossbow fire. For the first hour, it was a brutal missile exchange. Men on both sides fell, shields splintered, armor deflected some hits, but not all. The noise was deafening. Tens of thousands of men shouting, commanders barking orders, the hiss of arrows, the impact of bolts hitting shields and bodies. The Christian line held. They were on higher ground, which gave them a defensive advantage. Their formation was tight, which limited the effectiveness of flanking missile fire. And their commanders kept them disciplined. No one broke, no one panicked. They took casualties, but they absorbed the punishment. Then the Almohad main infantry line advanced. This was the real test. Thousands of Berber and Arab soldiers, armed with swords, spears, axes, moving forward in tight formations, screaming war cries, determined to smash through the Christian center. The two lines collided with a crash that could be heard across the entire battlefield. This is where medieval combat gets visceral. It's not like the movies, it's not choreographed sword fights. It's brutal, grinding, exhausting. Soldiers packed shoulder to shoulder, shoving, stabbing, trying to break the enemy line through sheer physical pressure. The front ranks fight and die. The ranks behind push forward, stepping over bodies, taking the place of the fallen. You can't see the whole battlefield. You can only see the man in front of you trying to kill you. The noise is overwhelming. The smell, blood, sweat, shit, fear is nauseating, and it goes on for hours. The Christian line bent, it buckled, but it didn't break. The Castilian infantry in the center, supported by the military orders, held their ground. The Aragonese and Navarrese wings, under pressure from Almohad flanking cavalry, fought desperately to maintain cohesion. Men died by the hundreds, by the thousands. The wounded screamed, the dead piled up, and still the line held. This was the critical moment, because Al-Nasir's plan was working. His army was slowly, steadily grinding down the Christian resistance. The flanks were under enormous pressure. The center was strained. If the Almohads could sustain this pressure for just a little longer, the Christian line would collapse. And once it collapsed, the rout would be total. The Almohad cavalry would run down the fleeing Christians, and the battle would turn into a massacre. But Alfonso saw it happening. And he made a decision. He committed his reserve, the heavy cavalry. This wasn't a desperate gamble. This was a calculated tactical move. Alfonso had been holding his best cavalry in reserve specifically for this moment. He had been waiting for the Almohad army to commit fully to the assault, to push everything forward, to leave their command position exposed. And now, with the Almohad infantry fully engaged and the Almohad cavalry focused on the flanks, he saw his opening. He gave the order. The heavy cavalry, knights, military orders, Castilian nobles, the best equipped and best trained horsemen in the Christian army formed up, and they charged, not at the Almohad front line. That would have been pointless. The Almohad infantry was too dense, too well organized. Cavalry charging into massed infantry in a frontal assault doesn't work. The horses balk. The infantry uses spears and polearms to bring down the riders. It's a meat grinder. Number Alfonso sent his cavalry around the engaged infantry, exploiting a gap that had opened on the Almohad left flank, and aimed them directly at the Caliph's command position. At the royal tent, at the Black Guard, at Al-Nasir himself, it was audacious, it was risky. If the charge failed, if it got bogged down, those cavalry would be isolated and destroyed. But if it succeeded, it would cut the head off the Almohad army. The heavy cavalry thundered across the plain, hundreds of armored knights, lances leveled, moving at full gallop, smashing into the rear of the Almohad formation. They tore through the first lines of infantry like they weren't even there. Lances punched through shields and armor. Horses trampled men. The shock and speed of the charge broke everything in its path. The Almohad commanders tried to redirect troops to counter the cavalry, but it was too late. The momentum was too great. The cavalry drove deeper, scattering units, causing panic, and closing the distance to the Caliph's position. The Black Guard formed up to defend the royal tent. These were elite soldiers, the best the Almohads had. They knew what was at stake. If the Caliph fell, the army fell. They locked shields, braced spears, and prepared to fight to the death. And they did. The Christian cavalry hit the Black Guard line, and the fighting turned savage. This wasn't about maneuver anymore. This was about raw violence. Knights and guards hacking at each other with swords and axes, horses rearing and kicking, men screaming, blood everywhere. The Black Guard fought with desperate ferocity, killing dozens of Christian knights, but they were outnumbered, overwhelmed, and slowly, inevitably, they were pushed back. Sancho VII of Navarre personally led part of the charge. Legend says he and his knights broke through the Black Guard line and reached the Caliph's tent. Whether Sancho actually entered the tent himself is debated, but what's certain is that the Christian cavalry broke the Black Guard, overran the command position, and captured the royal standard. Al-Nasir fled. He abandoned his tent, mounted a horse, and rode for his life, escorted by whatever cavalry he could gather. He didn't rally his army. He didn't attempt a counterattack. He ran. And when the Almohad soldiers saw their caliph fleeing, saw their command position overrun, saw their royal standard in Christian hands, morale collapsed. Units began to break. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. The Almohad flanking cavalry, which had been pressuring the Christian wings, disengaged and retreated. The entire army, which had been on the verge of victory just minutes before, disintegrated into a panicked rout. Now the slaughter began, because a retreating army in medieval warfare is defensively vulnerable. Christian cavalry pursued the fleeing Almohads across the plain, cutting them down by the thousands. Christian infantry advanced into the Almohad camp, killing anyone who resisted, capturing supplies, and setting tents on fire. The Almohad rout turned into a massacre that lasted for hours. Men were chased for miles, some drowned trying to cross rivers, others were hunted down in the hills. Many simply collapsed from exhaustion and were killed where they lay. The battlefield after Las Navas was a nightmare. Estimates of Almohad casualties range from 60,000 to 100,000. That's not an exaggeration. Medieval chroniclers on both sides agree. The Almohad losses were catastrophic. Entire units were annihilated. The Black Guard was destroyed. Al-Nasir's army, which had marched into Spain as the most powerful military force in the Western Mediterranean, ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Christian casualties were also significant, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 dead, but proportionally, they were a fraction of the Almohad losses. More importantly, the Christian army remained intact. They had won. Decisively, Alfonso VII did pursue Al-Nasir immediately. His army was exhausted. His men needed rest, needed to treat the wounded, needed to secure the battlefield. But he knew what this victory meant. The Almohad threat was broken. The strategic balance in Iberia had shifted. For the first time in decades, the Christians weren't just defending, they were positioned to attack, and they did. Over the next 40 years, the Christian kingdoms of Spain steadily pushed south, conquering city after city, until by 1250, Muslim Spain was reduced to the tiny kingdom of Granada. Las Navas didn't end the Reconquista, but it made the end inevitable. The Almohads never recovered. Al-Nasir returned to Morocco in disgrace, his reputation shattered, his empire destabilized. He died 2 years later. The Almohad Caliphate fractured into rival factions, collapsed into civil war, and by 1269, it no longer existed. Las Navas de Tolosa didn't just change a battle. It changed the trajectory of European and Mediterranean history for centuries. So what are the lessons here? What does Las Navas teach us about warfare, strategy, and leadership? First, never underestimate the power of unity. The Christian victory at Las Navas was only possible because 3 rival kingdoms put aside their differences and coordinated. That unity was temporary, it was fragile, but it was enough, and it worked. Compare that to the Almohads, who had numerical superiority but lacked strategic flexibility once their command structure broke. When Al-Nasir fled, there was no secondary leadership to rally the army. The entire force depended on a single man, and when he ran, everything collapsed. Decentralized decision-making matters in warfare. If your entire strategy hinges on one leader staying on the battlefield, you're vulnerable. Second, terrain and timing are everything. Alfonso's decision to march through the mountains and force a battle on relatively open ground was brilliant. He didn't wait for the Almohads to come to him. He dictated the time and place of the engagement, and when the battle came, he used terrain to his advantage, higher ground for defense, open space for cavalry maneuver. The heavy cavalry charge that broke the Almohad line wasn't luck, it was planning. Alfonso waited for the exact moment when the Almohad formation was fully committed, then exploited the gap. Third, morale wins wars. The Almohad army was massive, experienced, and well-equipped. But when their caliph fled, when they saw their command position overrun, they broke. Combat effectiveness isn't just about numbers or equipment, it's about belief. The Christian soldiers believed they were fighting for survival, for their kingdoms, for their faith. They had no fallback plan. Losing meant annihilation. That desperation translated into resilience on the battlefield. The Almohads, by contrast, believed they were fighting an inferior enemy. When that belief shattered, so did their cohesion. Fourth, leadership matters. Alfonso VII wasn't a military genius. He had lost battles before, but he learned from those defeats. He prepared, he built alliances, he planned carefully. He made hard decisions, like committing the cavalry reserve at exactly the right moment, that changed the outcome of the battle. Compare that to Al-Nasir, who was competent but overconfident. He underestimated his enemy. He positioned himself too far from the fighting to react quickly. And when the crisis came, he fled instead of rallying his forces. That one decision destroyed his army and his legacy. Finally, Las Navas teaches us about the limits of empire. The Almohads were powerful. They controlled vast territories, commanded huge armies, and had dominated the region for decades. But they overextended. They invaded without adequate intelligence, fought a battle they didn't need to fight, and lost everything in a single afternoon. Empires are fragile. They look invincible until they're not, and when they break fast. Las Navas de Tolosa was one of those rare battles that genuinely changed history. It ended Almohad dominance in Iberia. It shifted the Reconquista from defensive survival to offensive conquest. It paved the way for the eventual Christian reconquest of Spain and, centuries later, the Spanish colonization of the Americas. Without Las Navas, the political and religious map of Europe and the Mediterranean looks completely different. And yet, outside of specialized history circles, most people have never heard of it. It doesn't have the name recognition of Hastings or Waterloo. It doesn't get the Hollywood treatment, but it mattered. It mattered enormously. So here's my challenge to you. If you found this valuable, if you learned something, hit that like button, leave a comment, tell me what you think. Was Las Navas really as decisive as historians claim? Could the Almohads have recovered if Al Nasir had stayed on the battlefield? What other forgotten battles deserve this level of analysis? And subscribe, because this is what we do here. Real history, deep dives into the battles and events that shaped the world. No oversimplification, no fluff. Just the detailed, tactical, strategic truth about how history actually happened. Las Navas de Tolosa, July 16, 1212, 70,000 Christians, 125,000 Almohads, 6 hours of combat, and the fate of Spain decided in a single cavalry charge. That's history. Now, let's dig deeper. Because the conventional narrative of Las Navas de Tolosa, brave Christians defeating the Muslim invaders, is oversimplified to the point of being misleading. The reality is far more complex, far more interesting, and far more instructive about how power actually works in medieval warfare and politics. Let's start with a question nobody asks. Why did the Almohads invade in 1212 in the first place? Because they didn't need to. They controlled southern Spain. They had secure borders. They had trade routes, cities, agricultural production. They weren't facing an imminent Christian threat. So why march north with 100,000 plus men and risk everything in a single campaign? The answer is internal politics. Al Nasir wasn't just fighting the Christians. He was fighting to maintain legitimacy within his own empire. The Almohad Caliphate in 1212 was not the unified, stable power it appeared to be from the outside. It was facing internal dissent. Rival factions in North Africa questioned Al Nasir's authority. Local governors were asserting independence. The religious zealotry that had built the Almohad state was starting to fracture into competing interpretations of orthodoxy, and Al Nasir needed a victory, a big, decisive, undeniable victory that would silence his critics and consolidate his rule. He chose Spain because it was the obvious target. The Christian kingdoms were disunited, relatively weak, and had been on the defensive for decades. A successful campaign in Spain would bring glory, plunder, and proof of divine favor. It would allow Al Nasir to return to Morocco as a conqueror, not just an administrator. It was a political calculation dressed up in religious language. But here's the problem. Military campaigns launched primarily for domestic political reasons tend to go badly, because the strategic objective isn't actually about winning the war. It's about the appearance of winning. And when you're more concerned with how the campaign looks than with how it's actually conducted, you make mistakes. Al Nasir made several. The first was timing. He launched the campaign in early summer 1212, which meant his army would be operating in southern Spain during the hottest months of the year. That's brutal for soldiers. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, supply problems. It also meant the Christian kingdoms had time to coordinate a response. If Al Nasir had invaded in late fall or winter, the Christians would have struggled to assemble a unified force, but summer gave them the window they needed. The second mistake was intelligence. Al Nasir underestimated Alfonso. He assumed the Christian king would stay behind fortifications and wait to be attacked. He didn't anticipate that Alfonso would march south, cross the Sierra Morena, and force a battle in open terrain. That failure of intelligence cost him, because when the Christian army emerged from the mountains on July 13, the Almohads weren't positioned to intercept them. They were scattered across the plains near Jaén, gathering supplies and preparing for a siege campaign. They had to scramble to consolidate and form a battle line. That gave the Christians time to establish a defensive position and dictate the terms of engagement. The third mistake, and this is the critical one, was overconfidence. Al Nasir believed his numerical superiority guaranteed victory. He saw the Christian army, saw that it was outnumbered, and assumed the battle was already won. That's why he positioned himself at the rear, on a hill, away from the fighting. He wanted to observe the inevitable Christian collapse from a safe, commanding vantage point. He didn't expect to need to personally lead troops or make rapid tactical adjustments. He thought the sheer mass of his army would be enough. It was. And when the Christian heavy cavalry broke through and overran his command position, al-Nasir had no contingency plan. He panicked, he fled, and his army disintegrated. Now let's talk about the Christian side, because the Christian victory at Las Navas wasn't just about battlefield tactics. It was about logistics, diplomacy, and leadership decisions that took months of preparation. Start with Alfonso VII. This man spent 17 years preparing for Las Navas. After his defeat at Alarcos in 1195, he didn't just rebuild his army. He rebuilt his entire strategic approach. He studied the Almohads. He analyzed their tactics, their strengths, their weaknesses. He fortified his borders, built castles, established supply depots. He cultivated relationships with the other Christian kingdoms, slowly building trust and laying the groundwork for the alliance that would fight in 1212. He petitioned the Pope for crusade status, securing not just religious legitimacy, but also financial and military support from across Europe. This wasn't improvisation. This was systematic, long-term strategic planning. Alfonso understood that defeating the Almohads required more than just winning a battle. It required creating the conditions for victory. Assembling the right allies, securing the resources, choosing the right time and place. And when the moment came in 1212, he was ready. Compare that to al-Nasir, who launched his invasion based on political expediency and overconfidence. The difference in preparation is stark. One leader spent nearly 2 decades building toward this moment. The other assumed his empire's power was sufficient. Then there's the alliance itself. The fact that Castile, Aragon, and Navarre cooperated at all is remarkable. These kingdoms hated each other. They had fought wars. They had competing territorial claims. Their rulers were rivals, both politically and personally, but they understood the stakes. If the Almohads destroyed Castile, Aragon and Navarre would be next. This wasn't friendship, it was survival. And that shared understanding held the alliance together long enough to win the battle, but even that alliance was fragile. During the march south, tensions flared. Aragonese and Navarrese commanders questioned Alfonso's decisions. Some of the foreign crusaders, knights from France, Germany, Italy, abandoned the campaign after the initial skirmishes, claiming the heat and difficulty of the march weren't what they had signed up for. Alfonso had to manage egos, mediate disputes, and keep the coalition from fracturing before the battle even began. That's leadership, not the glamorous, heroic kind, the unglamorous, exhausting kind that involves endless negotiation and compromise, and it worked. On July 16, 1212, when the Christian army stood on that plain facing an enemy force nearly twice its size, it stood together. That unity, as temporary and fragile as it was, made the difference. Now let's examine the battle itself in more tactical detail. Because the conventional narrative, Christian heavy cavalry smashes through Almohad lines and wins the day, is accurate but incomplete. There were multiple phases to this battle, and each phase had its own dynamics and critical decisions. Phase 1, the missile exchange. This lasted roughly an hour. Almohad archers and light infantry advanced to within range and began shooting. Christian crossbowmen returned fire. This was attritional warfare. Both sides were trying to weaken the enemy before the main lines engaged. The Christians had the advantage of higher ground, which meant their crossbow bolts had better range and impact. The Almohads had superior numbers, which meant more arrows in the air. Casualties mounted on both sides, but neither line broke. The key decision here was made by the Christian commanders: don't advance. It would have been tempting to push forward, to close the distance, and engage the Almohad infantry. But that would have given up the terrain advantage and allowed the Almohad cavalry to flank more easily. So the Christian line held position, absorbed the missile fire, and waited. Phase 2, the infantry clash. The Almohad main line advanced. Thousands of Berber and Arab infantry, moving in tight formations, crashed into the Christian center and wings. This was brutal, grinding combat. Men packed shoulder to shoulder, pushing, stabbing, hacking. The front ranks fought and died. The ranks behind stepped forward to replace them. This kind of fighting is exhausting. It's not just physically draining, it's psychologically devastating. You can't see the whole battlefield. You can only see the man in front of you trying to kill you. The noise is overwhelming. The smell, blood, sweat, excrement is nauseating, and it goes on for hours. The Christian line bent under the pressure. The center, held by Castilian infantry and reinforced by the military orders, held firm. But the wings, Aragon on the left, Navarre on the right, were under enormous pressure from Almohad flanking cavalry. Gaps started to open. Units began to waver. This was the moment when battles are won or lost. If the wings collapsed, the Almohad cavalry would roll up the Christian line from the flanks, and the entire army would be destroyed. Peter of Aragon and Sancho of Navarre held their ground. They moved up and down their lines, shouting encouragement, physically pulling wavering units back into position, leading by example. Medieval battlefield leadership wasn't about grand strategy. It was about being visible, being present, convincing your men that you weren't going to abandon them. And it worked. The wings held, barely. But they held. Phase 3, the cavalry charge. This is the phase everyone remembers. Alfonso, watching from his command position, saw that the Almohad army was fully committed. Their infantry was engaged. Their cavalry was focused on the flanks. Their reserves were thin. And their command position, Al-Nasir's royal tent, protected by the Black Guard, was exposed. Alfonso made the call, commit the heavy cavalry, not to reinforce the line, not to counterattack the flanking Almohad cavalry, but to go straight for the command position, to cut the head off the snake. This was a calculated risk. If the charge failed, if it got bogged down, if the Black Guard held, if Almohad reserves intercepted it, the Christian cavalry would be isolated and destroyed. And without that cavalry, the Christian line would eventually collapse under sustained Almohad pressure. Everything hinged on the cavalry breaking through quickly and decisively. They did. The charge, led by knights from the military orders, Castilian nobles, and contingents from Aragon and Navarre, smashed through the rear Almohad lines and drove toward the royal tent. The Black Guard formed up to defend. These were elite troops. Professional soldiers, the best the Almohads had. They locked shields, braced spears, and prepared to fight to the death. The collision was catastrophic. Lances punched through shields and armor. Horses trampled men. The Black Guard fought with desperate ferocity, killing dozens of Christian knights, but they were outnumbered. The Christian cavalry wasn't just charging, they were coordinating. Units hit the Black Guard line from multiple angles, breaking up the formation, creating gaps. Once the line broke, the Black Guard couldn't recover. Individual soldiers, no matter how skilled, can't hold against organized cavalry in open terrain. The Christian knights overran the command position. They captured the royal tent. They seized the caliph's standard, a massive symbolic loss. And Al-Nasir fled. That was the turning point, not just of the battle, but of the entire campaign. Because when the Almohad soldiers saw their caliph fleeing, saw their command position overrun, they understood, we're not winning this. We are losing. Morale collapsed. Units broke. The retreat turned into a rout. Phase 4, the pursuit. This was the bloodiest phase. A retreating army in medieval warfare is defensively vulnerable. Soldiers drop their weapons to run faster. Formations dissolve. Commanders lose control. And pursuing cavalry can kill with impunity. The Christian knights chased the fleeing Almohads across the plain, cutting them down by the thousands. Christian infantry advanced into the Almohad camp, killing anyone who resisted, capturing supplies, and burning tents. The slaughter continued for hours, well into the evening. The Almohad casualties were staggering. Modern historians estimate between 60,000 and 100,000 Almohad soldiers died at Las Navas or during the pursuit. That's not medieval exaggeration. That's based on logistical analysis, burial records, and contemporary accounts from both Christian and Muslim sources. An entire army, one of the largest ever assembled in medieval Iberia, was effectively destroyed in a single afternoon. Christian casualties were also significant, between 5,000 and 10,000 dead, but the Christian army remained intact. They had won decisively. Now let's talk about what happened after the battle, because the immediate aftermath of Las Navas reveals as much about medieval warfare and politics as the battle itself. Alfonso VII didn't immediately pursue Alnacia. He couldn't. His army was exhausted. His men needed rest, medical treatment, food. They had just fought a 6-hour battle in the middle of summer. They were dehydrated, injured, exhausted. Pushing them to pursue immediately would have been counterproductive. So Alfonso gave the order: secure the battlefield, tend to the wounded, gather supplies from the captured Almohad camp. The Christian army spent 3 days at Las Navas. They buried their dead, they treated the wounded, they celebrated, and they plundered. The Almohad camp contained vast quantities of supplies, weapons, armor, gold, silver, silk, food. The Christian soldiers stripped the camp bare. This wasn't just greed. Plunder was expected. It was part of the medieval military economy. Soldiers fought partly for pay, partly for faith, and partly for the chance to get rich from captured loot. Alfonso allowed it, because denying his men that reward would have destroyed morale. But after 3 days, Alfonso faced a decision. The Almohad army was shattered, but Al-Nasir had escaped back to Morocco. The route south into Andalusia was open. The Christian army could march deeper into Almohad territory, besiege cities, conquer land. This was the opportunity Alfonso had been preparing for, but his allies wanted to go home. Peter of Aragon and Sancho of Navarre both argued that their obligations were fulfilled. They had come to fight a battle. They had won. Now they needed to return to their kingdoms, which had been left vulnerable during the campaign. They couldn't afford to spend months campaigning in southern Spain. And many of the foreign crusaders, the knights from France, Germany, Italy, felt the same way. They had answered the crusade call. They had fought. They wanted to go home. Alfonso tried to convince them to stay. He argued that this was the moment to press the advantage, to conquer as much Almohad territory as possible while their enemy was weak. But Peter and Sancho refused, and without their forces, Alfonso's army wasn't strong enough to conduct a prolonged campaign in hostile territory, so the alliance dissolved. Peter and Sancho took their armies and went home. The foreign crusaders left. Alfonso was left with just his Castilian forces. He did conduct a limited follow-up campaign, capturing a few fortresses and raiding Almohad territory, but it was nothing compared to what could have been achieved with a unified Christian army. This is one of the frustrations of medieval warfare. Winning the battle doesn't automatically translate into winning the war. Logistics, politics, and the fragility of alliances matter just as much as battlefield success. Las Navas was a decisive Christian victory, but the strategic follow-up was limited because the coalition couldn't hold together. Still, the long-term impact was profound. Al-Nasir returned to Morocco in disgrace. His reputation was destroyed. He had promised his subjects a glorious conquest. Instead, he delivered one of the worst military disasters in Almohad history. His authority collapsed. Rival factions challenged him. Provincial governors declared independence. The Almohad Caliphate, which had been the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean, began to fracture. Al-Nasir died in 1213, just 1 year after Las Navas. The official cause of death was illness, but many historians suspect he was poisoned by rivals within his own court. His son and successor, Yusuf al-Mustansir, inherited a collapsing empire. Over the next 50 years, the Almohad state disintegrated. North African territories broke away. Al-Andalus fragmented into small, independent emirates. By 1269, the Almohad Caliphate no longer existed, and the Christian kingdoms of Spain, they surged south. In the decades after Las Navas, Castile, Aragon, and Portugal conducted a series of aggressive campaigns, conquering city after city. Córdoba fell in 1236. Valencia fell in 1238. Seville fell in 1248. By 1250, Muslim Spain was reduced to the tiny kingdom of Granada in the far south, which survived as a Christian vassal state until 1492. Las Navas de Tolosa didn't end the Reconquista. But it made the end inevitable. The balance of power shifted permanently. The Christians went from defending their northern territories to conquering the south. The Muslims went from being the dominant military force in Iberia to a shrinking, defensive remnant clinging to survival. And all of that happened because of one 6-hour battle on a hot afternoon in July 1212. Let's zoom out and ask the bigger question: why do some battles matter more than others? Because military history is full of dramatic clashes, heroic victories, and devastating defeats. Most of them are forgotten, a few are remembered, and a tiny handful, like Las Navas, are genuinely decisive. What makes a battle decisive? 3 factors. First, it has to fundamentally alter the strategic balance. Las Navas did that. Before the battle, the Almohads were the dominant power in Iberia. After the battle, they were a collapsing empire. The Christian kingdoms, which had been on the defensive for decades, suddenly had the initiative. That's a strategic shift. Second, it has to have consequences that extend far beyond the battlefield. Las Navas triggered the disintegration of the Almohad Caliphate, the conquest of southern Spain, and the eventual unification of Spain under Christian rule. Those consequences shaped European and Mediterranean politics for centuries. They influenced the Crusades, the colonization of the Americas, the religious and cultural identity of Spain. That's long-term impact. Third, it has to reveal something fundamental about warfare, strategy, or human nature. Las Navas teaches us about the dangers of overconfidence, the importance of unity, the fragility of empires, the role of leadership in crisis. Those lessons are timeless. They apply just as much today as they did in 1212. Not every battle meets those criteria. Most battles are tactically interesting but strategically irrelevant. They don't change the course of the war. They don't have long-lasting consequences. They don't teach us anything we didn't already know. Las Navas meets all 3 criteria. That's why it matters. That's why we're still talking about it 800 years later. So what do we take away from all of this? What's the lesson of Las Navas de Tolosa? Here's mine. Arrogance kills empires. The Almohads were powerful. They were experienced. They had every material advantage. And they lost because they underestimated their enemy, overestimated their own strength, and failed to adapt when the battle didn't go according to plan. Al-Nasir believed his numerical superiority made victory inevitable. He positioned himself too far from the fighting to react quickly. And when the crisis came, he fled instead of rallying his forces. Compare that to Alfonso, who spent 17 years preparing, built a fragile but effective alliance, made hard tactical decisions, and stayed on the battlefield when the outcome was in doubt. He didn't win because he was a military genius. He won because he was disciplined, patient, and willing to take calculated risks. That's the difference between a leader who reacts to events and a leader who shapes events. Al-Nasir reacted. Alfonso shaped. And when the battle was over, one went home in disgrace, and the other went home as the savior of Christian Spain. Las Navas de Tolosa, July 16, 1212, 70,000 Christians, 125,000 Almohads. A 6-hour battle that broke an empire and changed the fate of Spain for the next 300 years. And if you're still with me, if you made it this far, I want to hear from you. What do you think? Was Las Navas really as decisive as historians claim? Could the Almohads have recovered if Al-Nasir had stayed on the battlefield? What other battles deserve this level of analysis? Drop a comment, let's debate. And if you want more content like this, deep, detailed, unfiltered military history, subscribe, hit that notification bell, because this is what we do here, real history. Not the sanitized version, the complicated, messy, fascinating truth about how the world actually works. Las Navas de Tolosa, the day Christian Spain broke the Almohad Empire. That's history, real history.